Hello, and welcome to a special presentation hosted by the National Apartment Association and CoStar Group on the implications of COVID-19 for the U.S. multifamily market. This is Michael Cohen, Vice President of CoStar's Advisory Services, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Joseph Biazzi and Andrew Rubchinsky, along with Paula Munga, NAA's Assistant Vice President for Industry Research and Analysis. The coronavirus pandemic has profoundly impacted all aspects of daily life in the U.S. How we work, shop, interact, and view our future economic prospects. While health officials and policymakers formulate a longer-term response to the battle against COVID-19, the full force of the health crisis has become quite visible in the economy and apartment market. During today's prepared remarks, the CoStar team will address the U.S. macroeconomic outlook, key themes in expected relative performance across markets, and provide an overview on the U.S. multifamily market. Paula Munga will then close out our presentation with a review of findings from a joint NAA-IREM member survey on the impacts of COVID-19. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, we won't be taking questions today. At this point, I'll turn to Joseph Biazzi to begin with a discussion of the U.S. economic outlook. Joey?
Thanks, Michael. While the public health and economic situation across the country have continued to decline, policymakers and economists have begun to look past what will happen tomorrow and towards the medium and long-term consequences of the Great Lockdown. We have forced businesses to close down and consumers to drastically change their routines in a matter of weeks. What the world will look like after the crisis remains to be seen, but we are starting to get some clues. We're going to start out today by looking at what the forecasts are showing. This is the most recent Oxford Economics forecast for annualized quarter-over-quarter economic growth. Remember, these forecasts are based on the U.S. getting some control of the virus and being able to ease social distancing. If the lockdowns continue for longer than expected, we should see further revisions down. The left chart shows quarter-over-quarter decline in employment. While the March jobs report was disappointing, it actually undercounted the number of job losses by a fair margin. We would expect job losses in the second quarter to reach nearly 30 million and send the unemployment rate to the mid-teens, roughly 50% higher than the peak of the Great Recession. We would advise against looking exclusively at the unemployment rate, however, as it will not tell the whole story in this crisis. We also expect significant declines in the labor force and a sharp rise in marginally attached workers. The unemployment rate also does not include those whose hours or pay were cut. With employment losses, we would also expect GDP losses. This morning, the BEA announced GDP fell by an annualized rate of 4.8% in the first quarter. Business investment declines accelerated, with structure spending declining 9.7% and equipment spending shrinking over 15% as businesses pulled back from long-term investments. Consumption, which accounts for 70% of total GDP, posted its worst single quarter decline in 40 years, shrinking at an annualized rate of 7.8%. The report also began to give us clues into how consumers shifted their spending patterns. Consumption of services and durable goods fell dramatically as spending on motor vehicles fell 33% and recreation services fell 30%, for example. However, consumption of groceries increased 25%. The report only includes data through the end of March, and unfortunately, second quarter GDP is expected to decline at an annualized rate of 31%, which would make it easily the single worst quarterly decline in the last 70 years. In the second half of 2020, we expect the economy to begin to bounce back. However, it will only make up some of the ground lost in the second quarter, making the recovery a U-shape. There's been a lot of debate about the shape of the recovery, whether it is a U-shape or a V-shape. A V-shape would imply a relatively quick return to previous economic activity levels. Unfortunately, while every recession has their unique characteristics, a common theme of the recovery is the economy takes time to recover lost jobs. Starting out in the top left-hand corner, this shows real GDP and its projection plus a trend line for the last 10 years. You can see that while GDP starts growing in the second half of the year, it is below trend and remains that way for quite some time. The reason is because of employment. The right-hand chart shows the change in unemployment versus the change in GDP for every quarter stretching back to 1980. This is called Okun's Law, and for the US, it shows that for every 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate, there's a 1% decrease in GDP. So we know economic growth is tied closely to employment. Now, if we look at the bottom chart, we can see employment levels over the last 50 years, with the numbers showing how long it took after each recession to return to pre-recession peaks. Note that with each recession, it took longer to get back to the old employment level. Also note that it took 2 to 4 years on average to return to the pre-recession peak employment. Consumption makes up 70% of GDP. Consumer spending is linked to employment, so if less people are employed, GDP will be lower. We are in a situation where we are losing jobs fast, and even when those job losses stop, uncertainty is going to cause consumers to save more of their income. It will take time to recover, and therefore this cannot be a V-shaped recovery, because unless everyone goes back to the same job as before and can feel secure quickly, it's going to be a while before we get employment back to where it was in February 2020. Now, as I said earlier, the March unemployment rate kind of undercounted the number of unemployed. And while the April report will give us a more accurate picture of the situation, the fast-moving nature of this crisis means the information will be somewhat stale by the time it is released a week from Friday. Looking at the last 5 weeks of unemployment claims, we can get a better idea of the true figure closer to real time. Roughly 26 million workers have filed for unemployment insurance claims, or 16% of labor force. Looking at the chart, we can see some states like Hawaii and Michigan have been hit harder than others, though every state is far above historical norms. Some states have struggled to keep up with the sheer volume of initial claims, so even these statistics are likely undercounting the true number of workers filing for unemployment insurance. If we plot the unemployment claims as a percent of labor force against the change in visits to retail and recreation areas, according to Google cell phone data, we can see states that were more successful to locking down their citizens tend to suffer more unemployment claims. Not everyone who files for unemployment has been laid off, but they are losing income, and that uncertainty of their job status will affect how they consume. For those that have been laid off, it's hitting a cross-section of industries that we typically consider safe. While the retail and accommodation sectors are expected to take up half the job losses, state government workers and healthcare workers not related to fighting the virus are also seeing their jobs threatened as elective surgeries were canceled and state budgets are stretched. So while the unemployment decline deepens, consumers expect changes to their habits and personal finances to last for multiple months, according to a recent survey by McKinsey. Consumer expectations will be important in the next few months and during the recovery. If consumers expect a long period of impacted finances and routines, they're more likely to save and put off decisions like travel. As the economy recovers from the coronavirus shock, consumer spending, both immediate and planned, will be vital to getting the economy back to pre-recession levels quickly. We expect as employment levels begin to grow again and social distancing orders ease, these timelines will shorten, but a double dip could make consumers even more cautious and despondent, as re-entering the lockdown situation will hurt already weak consumer confidence further. This is one of the major risks of reopening the economy too early. If consumers view the medium-term prospect as one in a lockdown situation with risk to their personal finances, consumer sentiment could take longer to return, slowing the recovery. We've already begun to see the effects of consumer expectations on both sentiment and savings. The April decline in consumer sentiment from the University of Michigan survey is the single largest month-to-month change in the 42-year history of the survey. That decline in consumer sentiment has been paired with a 31% increase in the amount of checkable deposits since the end of February. Checkable deposits are essentially demand deposits that a depositor could write a check against, such as a checking, savings, or money market account. Consumers saving instead of spending means they will likely suffer a conventional decline in aggregate demand recession, on top of these shocks that are caused by the lockdowns. This loss in confidence will take some time to regain and likely last after social distancing measures are eased. There is some potential for pent-up demand being released with consumers saving more money, but job losses and uncertainty mean consumers will not be buying goods at the same rate pre-COVID until they feel economically secure. But it's not only spending levels that we expect to change post-COVID. In a survey conducted by McKinsey, they looked at net intent, or essentially the share of consumers more likely to increase a given behavior post-COVID, minus the share that expects to decrease that behavior. What they found was more people said they would buy non-grocery items online, but they were also more likely to use a physical grocery store. Notably, they also said they would travel, go shopping at malls, and frequent events less. This suggests the problems being faced by both the hospitality and retail industries will continue even after the crisis is over. The lockdowns effectively forced consumers to change their behavior and routines drastically in a short amount of time. And some of those changes are here to stay. The same survey found that many consumers are trying substitutes for various in-person services. Many have said they would stick with at-home fitness or stream online after the crisis is over. Residents stuck at home are also cooking more often. Now, we are not saying gyms, movie theaters, and restaurants are going to have no consumers when they open back up, nor will all the respondents in the survey even keep their word. But changes at the margin still matter, and those consumers that invested time into home fitness and entertainment might begin to rely on home more than they did pre-crisis. We have seen some of the short-term changes in consumer buying show up in retail sales data. Retail sales saw record declines in March, with likely even worse declines coming for April. Looking at the breakdown, we can see non-necessity goods lost significant sales, while necessity goods like groceries gained. Consumers are not only saving more, but they are also changing their purchasing habits in both goods and services. The GDP report from the BEA released this morning showed consumption of services shrank 10.2% in the first quarter of 2020, as spending on everything from healthcare to transportation services declined sharply. As we said before, some of this should be short-term. Most stores are closed, services are shut down, and consumers are being advised to only go out for necessities. We would also expect to see some pent-up demand as purchases are being held off. However, this pent-up demand will not completely replace sales, and retailers will experience permanent demand loss from the crisis. Now, the federal government and the Fed have not been silent in the face of the crisis. The Fed has rolled out every applicable crisis era program and then some, intervening in markets in ways a few months ago, frankly, were unthinkable in an attempt to backstop liquidity in the financial system and get credit markets moving. As for the federal response, a few weeks ago, the US government passed a $2 trillion stimulus package meant to help companies and households bridge the economic crisis. This bill includes hundreds of billions of dollars of loans, tax credits, and financial support for everything from airlines to individuals, in a bid to effectively pause the economy and support households and business balance sheets. For example, one program is the unemployment insurance. In most states, a worker making the average income in their state who is laid off will actually receive more than their previous income in unemployment insurance due to this new stimulus bill. However, the rollout has been off to a slow start. State unemployment offices have been overwhelmed with requests, and there's been confusion from lenders about how some of these programs would work, and many have not received their stimulus checks. The payroll protection program has already run out of money, and concerns have been raised about which businesses have received the aid. The stimulus plan is unprecedented, not only in its size, but the speed in which it was rolled out. So there was always going to be bumps in the road here. But in this crisis, every day matters, and the longer workers and businesses go without support, the more jobs will be lost, more debt will be accrued, and more businesses shut down permanently, which will slow down the recovery even further. So the federal government programs have not been the only ones with some slow rollouts. Much of the money allocated by the Fed to support credit markets and businesses have not been deployed. Part of the reason for the slow rollout, much like the stimulus plan, is many of these programs have never been done before. Some are breaking century-old central banking traditions. One of the biggest breaks in tradition is the Main Street Lending Program, which is currently set to lend out up to $600 billion in loans to qualified borrowers. These loans are risky compared to other past Fed efforts and enter a new territory for the central bank. Typically, the Fed only invests in investment-grade assets and has never lent really directly to businesses. The Fed also entered the commercial mortgage-backed securities, or CMBS market. As part of their new QE program, the Fed is buying agency-backed CMBS, which is exclusively multifamily, and allowing AAA CMBS as part of a collateral program. These efforts should help free up credit in some markets, but the programs will produce winners and losers. The Fed is extremely risk adverse, and oil companies, which are overloaded with debt and private label non-AAA rated CMBS markets, have been mostly left without support. One sector we have mentioned briefly, but probably should mention more, is oil. Mining companies, which include oil producers, have received the most dollars per worker of any sector from the payroll protection program. so they have effectively been locked out of the Fed's Main Street lending facilities. Oil companies, which have been borrowing heavily during the previous cycle and have had some of the highest default rates of any sector, were concerned even before the pandemic. Now, with the addition of a severe demand shock stemming from the lockdowns, over 30% of publicly traded shale explorers could be forced to exit the market, according to Evercore analysts. Failing companies will produce more unemployed workers, with metros like Houston and Oklahoma City feeling the brunt of the damage. While the benefit of lower energy prices cannot be enjoyed by consumers who aren't commuting and businesses who are not operating. Current prices cannot support the current rigs, let alone expand production. And with an uncertain future for oil demand ahead, we expect oil-centric metros to struggle and the financial industry to feel the strain of elevated default rates. So we're going to take a really quick look at financial markets so we can get a good view of which property types are getting hit the hardest so far. While public market losses are likely higher than private market losses, the relatives here are still informative. REITs have lost about 20% of their value year to date, as concerns about the commercial real estate market have taken hold. In the same vein as sales and prices, changing consumer and business preferences are being shown here, as well as the effects of lockdowns. Some of these prices reflect long-term trends, particularly the relatively good returns from industrial and data centers. The Great Lockdown has forced many consumers to try both working from home and buying goods online. While we're not calling for the complete demise of both office and brick and mortar retail, a permanent change in behavior at the margins will create winners and losers. Maybe the lockdown accelerates the takeover of e-commerce, or companies begin to move to a more flexible office format, where workers can also work from home. Lockdowns have forced consumers and businesses to change their habits in a matter of weeks, and some of those habits are likely here to stay. So, just to recap, we are living through some extraordinary times. The economic shock from lockdowns will be significant, and the recovery will stretch at least into 2021. The stimulus is substantial, but probably not enough, and Congress is already preparing new rounds. The lockdown has forced changes to consumption habits. Some are temporary. We're going to still buy clothes at the end of this, but others will be more permanent and affect how we consume and live. Uncertainties still remain in even the short-term outlook, but one thing is becoming clear. The effects of this crisis will last long after we defeat the virus. With that, I will pass it off to Michael Cohen to talk about relative market performance.
Thank you, Joey. And again, our sincere apologies for the technical issues we experienced at the beginning of this presentation. Hopefully that was not disruptive to anyone listening to our prepared remarks. Every recession is different, with different drivers and impacts. Here we've charted metros by their industry location quotient, which looks at the employment concentration of a given industry. A higher location quotient means the metro has a higher reliance in a specific industry for its employment base. We looked at this industry concentration metric on the x-axis against office vacancy increases on the y-axis during different recessions in order to get a better understanding of the relative impacts by market. We're using office here as a proxy for white-collar employment. On the left, we focus on the dot-com bubble of 2001, and we can see that metros with higher tech location quotients were hardest hit after the bubble burst. But in the Great Recession of 2008, on the right, there was almost no relationship between tech markets and increases in vacancies. Here we look at metros with high employment concentrations in the construction industry, and it is clear there was almost no relationship between metros with a high construction industry concentration and office vacancy increases during the dot-com bubble, while in the Great Recession of 2008, we can see a strong relationship between the two. Meaning, the Great Recession impaired growth across the US, but most acutely in housing bust markets. There are certainly some markets which exhibit higher employment volatility during recessions, but the root causes of recessions are clearly what matter the most. Leisure, hospitality, and retail are most directly impacted by the COVID recession and the social distancing guidelines that have come with it, with the majority of these businesses now closed temporarily or in some cases indefinitely. Las Vegas, Orlando, New Orleans, San Diego, and Miami, with high employment risk scores in these particular sectors, are facing significant headwinds. Houston and Oklahoma City, with a high reliance on the energy sector, which is dealing with the dual shock of weaker demand and an oil supply glut, are also set to face a prolonged downturn. Additionally, major manufacturing metros like Detroit are facing significant challenges as manufacturers grapple with disruptions in supply chain linkages and a much weaker demand outlook for durable goods as the US consumer retrenches and focuses purchases on essential items. Tech, transport, and medical markets, in turn, are poised to weather the storm relatively better. The high-tech and biotech markets of San Jose and Boston are well positioned as these industries are somewhat insulated from the impact and may even benefit from increased reliance in the technology and the medical fields. The transport metros of Memphis, Chicago, and Philadelphia may also perform somewhat better given the continuous need to move essential goods around the country, though the significant slowdown in the movement of non-essential goods, along with decreased consumer demand going into 2021, may temper the eventual bounce back of these metros. In sum, this recession is like no other we've faced before, and we must look at the industries most impacted by social distancing in order to understand where the impact will be felt most acutely, though this recession is expected to have a broader impact than those that have come before. This time, we must also turn to different trends, like working from home, in order to better understand the relatives between markets. Working from home, which has become necessary during the pandemic, presents another potentially lasting impact on commercial real estate. As social distancing and shelter-in-place policies have moved many of us to home offices, some are now speculating to what extent this trend continues post-pandemic. While only a small minority of the US workforce works from home today, about half of the nation's occupations could be performed remotely, creating a potentially long runway for this trend to grow in the coming years. Here we can see that not all metro areas are equal when it comes to working from home. The 2018 American Community Survey found that most major markets range from between 4% and 9% of the workforce working from home. Smaller, tech-oriented markets like Raleigh, Austin, Denver, and Portland have the highest rates of remote working, which makes sense given that many tech jobs can be performed remotely. Metros that depend on in-person work, such as several hospitality-driven markets like Las Vegas and Honolulu, have lower rates of remote working. It stands to reason that markets that currently have higher rates of working from home would also be more likely to see the largest gains in future remote working as well. A recent survey of CFOs from Gartner revealed that 3/4 of firms have intentions of shifting at least some of their workforce to permanent work from home status post-pandemic. Should this come to fruition, it could have potentially significant effects on not only office demand, but also the urban retail demand population, which depends heavily on daytime population and also influence preferences around size of apartments and number of bedrooms in a particular unit. Fear of crowding in subways, offices, and other public gatherings threatens the 3-decade-long trend towards the re-urbanization of American cities. When we eventually begin to resume life as we know it over the coming months, larger cities with longer commutes and dependency on public transit will face unique challenges that smaller, more car-dependent cities will largely avoid. The core coastal markets, which include New York, Boston, DC, LA, San Francisco, and Seattle, as well as Northeast and Midwest metros, generally are the most reliant on transit and also the ones that have the longest commute times. We expect more employees in these metros to demand the ability to work from home or have more flexible schedules in the future. So to conclude this section, every recession presents a different set of challenges. While some markets tend to be more volatile than others, the root cause of each recession matters most. This pandemic-induced recession is having the most immediate impact on the leisure, hospitality, retail, energy, and manufacturing sectors. But the increasingly larger depth and potential duration of this downturn is likely to impact virtually all sectors of the US economy. Longer term, the impact of social distancing and the lingering threat of the coronavirus, even after the country reopens, has the potential to shift future land use patterns. Urban areas are facing the largest threat as a 3-decade-long renaissance of American cities is possibly at risk. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew Ruczynski, who will talk about the outlook for the US multifamily market. Andrew?
Thank you, Michael. Multifamily has held up well in previous recessions, but every downturn is different. As we head into this one, there are some specific weaknesses we've identified, as well as some areas of resilience. First, multifamily renters are uniquely exposed right now. In the left-hand chart, we see that renter households, the dark blue bars, have a decided leftward shift compared to owner households. Renter households are poorer, and over 55% of renter households make less than $50,000 a year. Looking at the chart on the right, we see that leisure and hospitality had the lowest median income of any industry sector in 2018. The March jobs report tells us that this sector shed jobs fastest, and we expect it to be a major chunk of job losses in next week's April jobs report. This implies that poorer households are feeling the brunt of this downturn at the outset, which bodes particularly ill for Class C units. We do expect federal money in the form of stimulus checks and enhanced unemployment benefits and payment protection plan to blunt the impact of employment losses, but we still expect those households to feel ill effects. This connection between low income and expected income losses is reinforced by a survey administered and analyzed by Kingsley Associates in partnership with our colleagues at apartments.com. They surveyed over 25,000 renters between April 10th and 16th, which revealed that households with less income were both more likely to suffer an income loss and more likely to miss their April rent payment. Reports by market participants relate a bigger struggle to collect rents at the low end of the market than the high end. Those same poor households are also reporting a higher likelihood of being unable or unsure about their ability to pay May rent. Those households that have lost income are also reporting a higher likelihood of moving because of the pandemic. A full 15% were not planning on moving and now are. It's important to note that although a large majority of those surveyed say their plan not changed, this does not mean that they were not already planning on moving, but that the pandemic has not changed how they were planning on moving. 38% of all respondents say they were planning on moving in the next 6 months, whether the pandemic changed those plans or not. Of those who plan to move, a plurality expect to pay less rent, and a large majority expect to pay the same or less. So while we do expect households in Class C apartments to feel the most pain, consistent downward pressure for cheaper units is not disappearing. Class C units may see higher churn and more missed rent payments, which will cause pain, but we expect demand for that to mostly hold up. So rent readings mostly reflect that. CoStar uses its feeds from apartments.com to track daily rent changes, and at around March 11th, rents started declining. The sharp decrease continued for some time, to the point that the market as a whole has given up all the rent gains for the year. However, big differences are apparent by class. 4- and 5-star buildings, the top quality in the CoStar database, are always the most volatile and reacted the most quickly and the worst, followed by 3-star, which is recovering at this point, and 1- and 2-star, which has had much less of a decline and possibly reflects the consistent downward pressure we mentioned earlier. While we're seeing varying levels of recovery across the board here due to demand factors that we'll explore later, we first want to check on unstabilized vacancies, which are chiefly a concern for 4- and 5-star properties. Vacancy in unstabilized properties, in this chart, those 8 quarters or less from delivery, spiked up to a cyclical high in 20Q1. This reflects both a new high in deliveries for the cycle and a sudden drop-off in demand. The result is 170,000 vacant units in an environment where households are nervous about income in the future, which tends to result in poor household formation. CoStar's forecast for the next couple of years reflects this, so lease-up properties will likely struggle as overall vacancy increases. These struggles will vary market by market, and already have. The majority of markets saw increases in their unstabilized vacancy rates over the past 2 quarters, including some nerve-wracking raises of over 20% in Cincinnati, Stamford, and New Orleans. Note that most of the biggest vacancy jumps were in metros with very low shares of inventory underway. This might seem counterintuitive, but it's actually a sign of market efficiency, as well as a result of demand hits not coming until the end of the quarter. Those markets had very little underway because they were generally fairly weak markets for multifamily to begin with. So even a minor downshift in demand greatly affected them, as opposed to faster growth markets like Orlando, Miami, Charlotte, Nashville, Austin, or Seattle, where growth was much stronger. We do expect some of those markets just named to hold up decently through this, but certainly a high share of inventory underway is a liability going into an environment where household formation will be constrained. A slight silver lining from a pure vacancy perspective is that a good number of projects will be delayed as some metros put explicit controls on construction, others put controls on building inspectors and other crucial officials needed to complete construction, and supply chains are slowed down. While this is technically good news for owners of newly completed buildings, many of those owners are developers as well who still have units underway. They'll now face more of an uphill battle to complete them. That trade-off is not worth it. An increase in unstabilized units is far from the only factor affecting the recent decline in rents. The job market is the single biggest factor affecting demand for apartments. When we plot rent decreases seen since March 11th against the share of employment in retail, energy, and leisure and hospitality by metro, we see that the metros with higher shares of employment in those exposed industries generally experience larger rent decreases. Other factors affecting rent declines include the relative volatility of markets and the timing and severity of restrictions on movement put in place for each market, which were and are far from uniform. We'll keep a close eye on what happens with Atlanta, Nashville, Memphis, and South Carolina markets as their respective states lift restrictions. In certain places, we've already seen rent losses paired to some degree, and that stems from a rebound in demand that we alluded to earlier. Working from data provided by our colleagues at apartments.com, we see a rebound in apartment searching. In the immediate aftermath of news breaking regarding the virus, search started turning off to the point where it decreased to 80% of volume in late March compared to early February. But apartment searchers have returned to the online marketplace, and furthermore, the data reveals that leads have recovered as well, which helps explain the rent loss charts we saw earlier that showed an improvement in rent readings. However, that's not to say that searchers haven't changed their preferences. The return to the online marketplace has been accompanied by a sharp uptick in virtual apartment tours. Searchers might have once preferred seeing places in person or not thought to look for virtual options. But with so many preferring to stay indoors in the face of disease and a likely struggle for many property managers to show apartments or provide entry, renters have taken to viewing apartments virtually. The shift towards more technical options is making itself felt in leads generation as well. Compared to the same period last year, the last 4 weeks have shown an increase in lead generation from email and websites. This comes at the cost of phone leads. We think that at least some of this is a result of leasing offices operating in different manners in response to social distancing, as well as renters' assumptions about how those offices will operate. Nevertheless, this shift towards more technical solutions tracks with the uptick in virtual tours and stories from the marketplace about creation of keyless or electronic entry tours. As traditional methods of apartment leasing become riskier or are ruled out, we expect landlords embracing technical solutions to gain or maintain a competitive advantage. We also notice that searchers have been looking outside of their home metros more often. Over the past few weeks, the share of total searches directed outside of the metro of origin spiked up. We expected this was in response to general unhappiness with the income or employment prospects in many metros, and that searchers were looking for greener pastures. Setting aside the fact that everywhere is hurting to some degree right now, we found searchers' preferences were fairly rational. Almost all metros saw increases in searches from the first week of February to the fourth week of April, but there are distinct differences when we look at searches coming from outside the market, or y-axis, which shows the increase in searches coming to markets from outside of them. At the same time, some markets saw their users looking outside of the market more, while some saw users looking outside of the market less, which is measured on the x-axis. Cleveland, for instance, on the far right, has a 40% increase in users looking outside the market, while there was no increase in users outside the market looking at Cleveland. The inverse of this is markets on the upper left. These include the tech markets of Austin and Raleigh, which lead the pack, while biotech markets of Boston and San Diego also fare well. Other markets on the left have their own strengths. Tech, again, in Seattle and the Bay Area. Memphis is a large freight hub, both by air and water. Now, Orlando's position towards the upper left is somewhat mystifying, we admit, though this may still correct itself, and this chart looks at a specific segment of searches, not the entire universe. Conversely, those markets towards the lower right had more of their occupants searching outside them and had less growth in non-occupants looking at them. Again, there is a pattern, as the leading energy market, Houston, appears in that area, and the leading tourism market, Las Vegas. Cleveland and Detroit, as manufacturing hubs, also check out, and South Florida is also very tourist dependent. But again, most have seen overall traffic pick up, showing that multifamily demand is already looking fairly resilient. In support of that resilience, we wanted to show behavior in the previous recession. Multifamily held up quite well in both rent drops and occupancy drops in the face of a very weak job market. Every recession is different, of course, but multifamily offers flexibility, low barriers to entry, and generally less expense on a monthly basis compared to home owning. Even if household formation slows enormously, as seems likely, many households will still see renting in multifamily housing as a necessity. The pain from this downturn will not be felt uniformly, though. Looking forward through our current forecast on a metro by metro basis, there are some real differences in performance. On the left side are markets forecasted to perform particularly poorly. Some of this is a matter of inventory underway, as in Stanford and Salt Lake City, where a sudden demand shutdown will severely hurt lease-up. Orlando, Houston, and Denver also appear in this section, appropriate given their exposure to tourism and energy. Core metros hold up a good bit better. In the case of San Francisco, New York, and LA, these cores have a more diverse employment base than many others, and the sectors that are concentrated in these markets should hold up relatively well. That will prevent these markets from suffering to the same extent as the metros on the left. As poor as this outlook might be for some of these metros, there are still a couple of tailwinds for multifamily in general that are reminiscent of the last recession. Looking forward, the demographic and economic drivers won't universally benefit or hurt apartment fundamentals. Growth in the prime renter cohort is slowing, but it's still positive through the next 4 years, seen in the black dotted line on the bottom chart. Further, the older part of that cohort, 30 to 34-year-olds, the red line, will be driving most of that growth. That is a positive in one sense, as those renters should be further in their careers and interested in paying more rent for better accommodations. It is a negative in another sense, as renters aging out of that range and making more money are more likely to become homeowners. Further, the red line does bend down eventually, as the orange line, which represents 25 to 29-year-olds, started to in 2019. However, there are still major headwinds working against younger cohorts. We often cite student debt as a good example of the burdens that recent college grads bear, and studies of median incomes and net worth show that millennials don't fare as well compared to other generations, per the Pew Research Center. These things stand in the way of home ownership, and the top chart shows that those under 40, the light blue sections of the bars, contributed negatively to net home ownership change through most of the last cycle. As the job market really heated up and home ownership rose in 2016 through 2019, the under 40 bars switched to net home ownership gains. We believe that this cooling job market will make home ownership harder for many, but particularly so for the under 40 cohort. In contrast, multifamily again requires much smaller initial outlays to move into, is often cheaper, and offers more flexibility. In a time of uncertainty where employment has taken a hit, those aspects will appeal to more households than usual. As the market continues to react to the coronavirus fallout, we know some things as certainties, some as likelihoods, and some as possibilities. We know that Class A rent will continue to struggle as household formation slows down due to employment losses and buildings in lease-up compete for tenants. We also know that markets with high concentrations in energy and tourism are experiencing the worst downturns, though it's important to note that other sectors are getting hit hard, like those associated with the performing arts. We expect the migration cycle to reset in the near future. Much of the migration to fast growth metros like Orlando, Phoenix, and Vegas is driven by job growth. As the jobs picture across the nation worsens, we expect that pull to disappear. In the initial stages of the last recovery, markets with high educational attainment took a higher proportion of net migration. We expect education to prove a decisive factor in this recovery as well. On the more speculative side, we believe that working from home will become more commonplace, and that, in turn, will increase the catchment area for commuters to downtown. In the instance of a commuter who used to commute for 2 hours every day, but now finds themselves coming into work perhaps half of that time, they may find commutes of a greater length more palatable as they occur less often. Different scenarios for this exist. Some believe that people will be in the office as little as once or twice a month. Some believe this whole episode will have little effect. But any effect at all will likely widen catchment areas, making suburbs and even exurbs more attractive to renters. Working against that trend will be the continued desire for the amenities of city life. No one knows exactly what the post-COVID world looks like, but we don't expect the world to completely upend itself. Certain aspects of living in the city will remain attractive, and if work from home trends couple with poor economic conditions to raise office vacancies, expect another wave of office to multifamily conversions, especially in older properties. This is in no way a comprehensive list of all of the fallout that will come from COVID-19, but it does represent some of the largest issues. The market is always changing, but this is a particularly momentous occurrence. We will continue to pay careful attention and recommend you do as well. With that, I'll hand it over to Paula for an overview of results of a recent NAA survey. Paula?
Thanks, Andrew. So NEA did a survey of its members. We partnered with IREM. The survey was open from April 13th to 17th. And the survey was conducted by CEL and Associates. We're planning to use the result in our advocacy efforts to inform and educate policymakers and the general public on the impacts of COVID-19 to the rental housing industry. We received 191 responses. We are pretty pleased with this. There's a lot of surveys out there right now, and owners and operators are being asked to complete those on a regular basis. We do plan to do this on a monthly basis until we get to the other side of this crisis, just so we can monitor what is going on in the apartment industry. Just to take a look at the respondent profile, so not surprising, we are focused on multifamily, but the respondents represented nearly 1 million units across the country. We did get a handful of responses from property owners who own properties with fewer than 5 units. And then just looking at sector, most of the properties were conventional. A lot of them had a mix of one or more of those types that you see on the graphic there on the right. And looking at region, both the Midwest received the largest number of responses, with Southeast and South Central, all of which received 40 or more responses. But overall, again, we were pretty pleased with the geographic dispersion. Most of the areas across the country received 20 or more responses. The first question we asked were, how many people have you helped so far? And we asked this question for March, and which was very early on, as you know, in the crisis. We know some of the responses included to date, so into April, and our owners and operators were able to help residents in over 155,000 apartments. That varies from payment plans to late fee waivers and some other assistance we'll talk about later. But we do plan to, we are positive that that number is going to soar when we do our next survey. We also wanted to know about the mortgage status, and just over 15% of our respondents are mortgage free, no debt. But clearly most of the people who answered the survey responded that half of them had mortgages on all of their properties, and then the remaining ones had mortgages on just some of their properties. And we wanted to get a sense of the mortgage cost burden for the apartment industry. So we asked, estimate the average monthly mortgage as a percent of your average monthly rent collected. And we found that half of the respondents indicated that their mortgage payment made up around 25 to 50% of rent collected. And in fact, NAA from this survey produced an infographic on where does your rent dollar go. And you can find that on our website. And what we found was you get $1 of rent, and after you pay your mortgage, after you pay your taxes, after you pay your staff, after you pay all your bills, you have about 9 cents left. So this was one of the questions that we used to inform that infographic. We also wanted to know about mortgage forbearance, and at the point, the last days the survey was complete, only about 29% of owners and operators answering the survey had contacted their mortgage holders about mortgage forbearance. And in fact, very few of the respondents received all of the forbearance that they requested, just 6.5%. Owners are generally optimistic. We wanted a question here about owner sentiment. And we started by phrasing this question as return to normal. And then we realized at this point, no one's really quite sure what normal is anymore. So we asked them to just take a look at their average operating metrics before the crisis and how long they thought it would be until those levels were brought back. And right now, as of mid-April, they were pretty optimistic. Around 6 to 11%, or 43.5% think things will be back to what they were in 6 to 11 months, and another 37% actually feel in fewer than 6 months they'll be seeing some normalcy back. And thankfully, nobody chose never, so no one's given up just yet. But we'll be monitoring this metric going forward in the coming months. There are high expectations for the CARES Act. Most of our respondents thought that it would be somewhat to very helpful. In fact, that's around 2/3 in terms of keeping their businesses viable over the next 12 to 18 months. We also wanted to know what they wanted to see in the next round of COVID-19 relief legislation, and we received a lot of responses. These were open-ended. They could fill in whatever they like. We shared this with our government affairs department, and they're using it in their advocacy efforts on Capitol Hill. But we saw a lot of, these are just 5 comments. We saw a lot of similar themes, mostly in the form of rent subsidies, so more help to residents. As you saw from Joseph's presentation, the unemployed are more than likely to be renters than those that were laid off in the lower income industries. So our owners want to see more help for residents. They also want to see the lifting of blanket moratoria on eviction. So really tying it more to financial hardships than just a one-size-fits-all policy. They also would like to see the PPP expanded to include all multifamily companies and clearer guidelines. We had a lot of comments that the state and federal guidelines were a little bit conflicting. And a lot of our owners and operators are concerned about what's going to happen with evictions. Once courts open in 6 months, there's going to be a big backlog in the courts. And finally, the slide you're looking at now is how have we helped financially burden residents. We had a lot of great stories that our owners and operators shared with us. There's things that are already, you hear a lot about the virtual tours and the lease signings able to be done online. We also have owners and operators that are already doing virtual amenities. So they're doing yoga and fitness classes online. We had one operator that opened a portal that enabled other residents in the building to help residents in terms of donating food or money or PPE. And they had a really fantastic response, and really just neighbors wanting to help neighbors. They just needed a mechanism to do it, was one of the comments we received. Also, we had some of our owners just donating paper products and cleaning supplies to their residents because, of, as you know, those are very hard to find these days. So we pulled together a lot of these stories, and we will be sharing those. We got permission from our owners and operators to share these. So you'll be seeing more of those going forward. And finally, I think we are right up against our time limit. So if there are questions, you can feel free to contact me. That's my email address. It's pmunger@naahq.org. And I would be happy to funnel your questions to whichever panelist is most appropriate. And we thank you so much for joining us. And thanks to CoStar for putting on a great presentation on the economy, specific markets, and apartment industry. Thanks, everyone.